Bibliophiles of the internet, I'm here to continue catching you up on what I've been reading during the recovery process, and today's focus is my favorite books I read in May. I also forgot to mention in my last recap video for April that I've been working on written reviews for every book I've read between April and June, which is a pretty monumental task. It's still a work in progress, I don't have reviews for everything yet, but my Goodreads and Storygraph are always linked down below if you would like to possibly learn more about these books. To start, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what I read in May. Just like in April, I read another 15 books in May, which is absolutely bonkers compared to my usual standards, so let's go through those. I read Two Can Play That Game by Leanne Young, Harrow the Ninth and Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, The Fraud Squad by Kyla Zhao, Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg, The Darkening by Sunya Mara, Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, Lone Women by Victor Laval, The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi, Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, St. Juniper's Folly by Alex Crespo, The Genesis of Misery by Niang Yang, Kismet Connection by Ananya Devarajan, and I reread She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. Now we're going to get into my 5 favorite books from that batch. Disclaimer, there would have been 6, but the 6th spot belongs to Harrow the Ninth and Nona the Ninth, and as I said in my last recap, I'm going to hold off on that for now because in the future I plan to make a different video for that series. So first up, we have Two Can Play That Game by Leanne Young. This is a super nerdy upper YA coming-of-age story with an underlying rivals to lovers romance component. It's about these two Australian Malaysian characters, Sam and Jason, who clash at a video game store when they're both trying to claim the last copy of a super rare indie game that happens to come with a ticket to a game design workshop that they both really want. So they decide the best way to settle things is to hold an indie video game tournament between the two of them where the winner takes all. Content warnings for mentions of experienced sexism and harassment, instances of underage drinking, depictions of hangover and vomit, as well as some references to bullying and ableism. This coming-of-age story is just a treasure trove for geeks everywhere. It is so much fun to read. The author actually has a background in video games, puzzle making, all that kind of stuff, and it really just shines through every facet of this story, from the character's passion for gaming to the actual games themselves. And all the games that Sam and Jason play in their one-on-one tournament are entirely fictional, which is really risky, not only because video games are highly visual and don't always translate to the page, but also because how can you understand the mechanics of games that don't exist? But again, Leanne Young has such a deft hand when it comes to writing about video games. She made me want to play these games, which again, do not exist. Sam is a game developer herself. That's a major part of the story because she's considering putting off university to continue working on her game. She wants to show her projects to industry professionals. She is putting everything she has into making this happen. And that's why the video game tournament is such a great plot device, because it's functioning on multiple levels. It's gradually building the relationship between Sam and Jason, it's a continuous reminder of what's at stake, especially for Sam, and it's also a conduit for Sam to reconnect with her love of video games. She's extremely driven, laser-focused, and in all reality, kind of obsessed with becoming a quote-unquote successful game developer, and that's why she needs to remember why she loves creating games in the first place. I also really love how the story explores culture and family dynamics, especially in immigrant families, especially in regards to how kids of immigrant parents internalize these standards of perfection to the point where they willingly turn those expectations on themselves. It's a story about love, about failure, it's about healing relationships, not being afraid to start over or go down the unexpected path. I love that it has college-age students, but it's still about self-discovery and growing pains. It's such a beautiful and satisfying story in so many ways. I gave this 4.5 stars. Next up is Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H. I was very kindly gifted a finished copy by The Dial Press. This is a queer memoir. It's about a South Asian Muslim immigrant who's sort of parsing their queer identities by assessing various stories in the Quran and very deliberately drawing parallels between those stories and different parts of their own life. Content warnings for references to suicidal thoughts and self-harm ideation, experienced racism, colorism, and Islamophobia, references to abusive marriages, and brief mention of pet death and grief. This memoir hit me like a ton of bricks. It is a response to queer religious trauma, which is very real and very valid, by way of grounding and reframing this traditional religious text in a new and deeply personal queer context. The whole book is like a radical exercise in self-love, because whereas many quote-unquote religious most purists would say that queer people are excluded from the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, whatever it may be, the author is responding with, actually, here are all the ways the Quran connects to, affirms, and celebrates my queerness. It's really powerful to take a religious text that many people use as a means to uphold their bigotry on a moral level, a text that's all too often misinterpreted in a way that promotes and sanitizes oppression, and to turn around and show the world how you see your queer self deeply embedded within those same teachings. In many ways, Hijab Butch Blues is the author refusing to accept those teachings of self-hatred and exclusion, refusing to abandon their faith on the basis of their identities and experiences, and just radically reimagining their relationship to faith through a queer lens. It's about Lamia learning that their queerness is divine. It's a love letter to queer people everywhere, whether they're religious or not, regardless of whether they're Muslim, that gives them permission to hope and permission to write themselves into all the places they've ever been erased. There are passages in this book that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It is a stunningly bold and triumphant memoir that I cannot recommend enough. 5 stars. Switching gears, next up we have Lone Women by Victor LaValle. This is a wonderfully genre-defiant book that blends together Western, historical fiction, horror, and mystery to tell the story of Adelaide Henry, a young black woman living in 1915. The story actually begins when her parents' corpses are burning along with the family farm, and she is off to become a homesteader in Montana and start anew. Her only companion on this journey is the mysterious steamer trunk that she takes everywhere and never, under any circumstances, unlocks. Content warnings for death and animal death, experienced racism and racist epithets, graphic injury and violence, instances of transphobia and misgendering, experienced PTSD, allusions to suicide, and some fade to black sexual content. Everything about this book just works. The structure, the writing, the setting, the atmosphere, it's all working together to maintain this high level of narrative intensity that never once lets up until the story ends. I wouldn't classify the story as a thriller, or at least it's not only that, but it has that same sort of energy. The short chapters, the inexplicable unknowns, the blistering prose all create this persistent feeling of unease and desperation that keeps you turning the pages. The story is also an incredibly bold reclamation of forgotten history. Even though it was unfortunately part of the ongoing colonial and capitalist project, there was a time where the government was giving out parcels of land to whoever could maintain them regardless of gender, marital status, or race. I love how that also connects to the horror element of the book because it is incredibly terrifying for Adelaide to be a black woman living on her own, miles away from any help or any resources with absolutely no connections. If some horror books are described as claustrophobic, this one's almost agoraphobic in some ways because it's just full of these wide open spaces, and in some ways that makes Adelaide much more vulnerable than she would be otherwise. And in some ways that seemingly contradictory parallel between openness and fear connects back to the steamer trunk. We have to talk about the trunk. It was such a great plot device, a constant source of suspense and fear, and even after you know what's in the trunk, there are still so many more surprises to come. It is literally an example of emotional baggage. It represents the ways we shackle ourselves to our shame, fears, self-doubt, and past mistakes, to the point where we're putting more energy into hiding ourselves than into living our lives. So the story is really about Adelaide learning to share those parts of herself and her history, no matter how horrifying or unsettling they might be, and allowing the people around her to decide what to do with it for themselves, which takes them all to some very surprising places. I will say, as you might have been able to glean from the content warnings, there is a side trans character who is publicly dead-named and misgendered, if I remember correctly, which I found to be borderline sensationalist. I don't think it was necessary as a means to solidify the villain characters as being villainous. I think they were doing a pretty good job of that already, so that's just a minor note from me as a trans person, but besides that, I was fully invested in this from start to finish. Such a wonderful amalgamation of genres, ideas, and thematic overtones. Absolutely loved it overall. 4.5 stars. Then, surprising no one, I had such a great time reading Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which I read as an arc from Del Rey and comes out on July 18th. Coincidentally, another historical horror story, and it's about Montserrat, who works as a sound editor in the Mexican film industry, and her childhood friend Tristan, who discovers that he's neighbors with this cult filmmaker who wants both of their help in completing an old unfinished film of his because he believes that doing so would break an ancient and powerful curse. Content warnings for references to cancer, experienced ableism and sexism, references to drug addiction and abuse, mentions of suicide, suicide ideation and attempts, explorations of anti-Semitism and white supremacy, death, and sexual harassment. Also worth noting, this story takes place in Mexico, as most of Silvia's stories do. Both Tristan and Momo are bisexual, so it's a queer story. Momo also has a disability, and Tristan is a Lebanese immigrant. I mean, I've said it before, but Silvia Moreno Garcia has never done me wrong a day in her life. She thinks of the coolest shit and just does it, regardless of convention, regardless of genre, and this story brilliantly takes the idea of movie magic to a very literal place. In some ways, I think Silver Nitrate is like a call and response to Silvia's first book, Signal to Noise, which was about magic spells that require music or records as a conduit. But here, the magic comes from this very singular kind of surrender that watching movies, especially collectively, evokes. So I think the two are definitely in conversation in the sense that they're both exploring how deeply personal connections to art has its own kind of power, has its own kind of magic. More importantly, this story is openly engaging with Mexico's past and present efforts to preserve white supremacy. We see it in the colorism, we see it in this ongoing colonial loyalty where the Spanish language is concerned, we see it in the purposeful erasure of how Mexican culture is built on unacknowledged indigenous beliefs and histories. So I think it's really clever how the story connects this hidden cult of Nazi loyalists with the discovery and use of dark occult magic. That narrative thread is definitely strongest with Momo, who's getting really caught up in researching this historical intersection between film, magic, and Nazi sympathizers, and also discovering that she sort of has an affinity for that same kind of magic. So as she starts learning about that magic and using it more often, that really speaks to the addictive, heady power that comes with privilege. When the oppressed gain a foothold among the oppressors, it can be hard to remember that our work is in dismantling systems of power, especially when participating in those systems of power benefits us. Momo and Tristan make some huge mistakes in this story. They both knowingly and unknowingly contribute to this resurfacing of white supremacists, and Momo really has to confront the question of how she can use those abilities to end the cycle rather than continuing to perpetuate it. Thematically, this story is so strong. It also has incredibly distinctive, headstrong characters, and it also functions as a compelling treatise on Mexican history and film history. While I do love how shit absolutely hits the fan at the end, I think the buildup is a little too gradual at times, and sometimes the historical explanations can be borderline info-dumpy, but neither of those things was make or break for me. Originally, I gave this 4 stars, but I think it's actually 4.5 stars. The last standout book I want to talk about is The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang, and when it came out last year, I was generously gifted a finished copy by Tor Books. This was pitched as Joan of Arc in space, and I can confirm that it's pretty much queer Joan of Arc in space. Maybe saying queer Joan of Arc is redundant, but I digress. It's about a non-binary character named Misery who's a known vagrant and who possesses the rare stoneworking powers of a saint. In this galactic empire, there's division between the monarchy and the religious sect, and the latter latches onto Misery's powers, which is why she decides to actually pose as this long-awaited messiah, and she finds herself trapped between these two powerful factions who both want to use Misery to finally end this war. Content warnings for parental death and grief, graphic violence, experienced ableism, both internal and external, instances of torture, and some fade to black sexual content. This book is just cool. I don't even know if I have anything intelligent to say about it. Sometimes you just read a sci-fi book with a badass concept and you're like, yeah man, this book is fucking cool. First of all, you have this absolute disaster trans character who's just knowingly wreaking havoc on every last person around them, who is actively and unapologetically living a lie that they don't even believe, and who is manipulating these two warring factions simply because they can. That is great. But also the story has really compelling political conflict, there's stone magic, there's badass mechas in space, there's epic galactic battles and risky gambits and intense dramatic payoff that results in these jaw-dropping moments. I could not get enough. But I think through all those twists and turns, through all the lies and the doubt, the story is really about the malleability of human nature, how we can contort ourselves into all these different shapes and possibilities depending on what we know or what we think we know, which is always changing. As the reader, you're constantly flip-flopping back and forth between what you should believe about the characters, about the story, and while that could be potentially off-putting, I think it actually makes you more invested because you want to see how it all plays out. But besides the intense action, the very cool magic, the commentary on religious righteousness and all that, at its heart, I think the story is about how we all want to believe in something. And on some level, we also want to be that something that other people believe in. We want people to believe in us. It's about the desperation that stems from those two desires, which sometimes can exist on their own trajectories and sometimes can be in conflict with each other. So what happens when those two components of human nature clash and come into conflict? This book would have been an easy 5 stars if not for two minor things. First, there are these sort of distant interlude sections that I don't think were entirely needed, and secondly, the ending is a little too abrupt and ambiguous for my taste. But even taking that into account, this was a super strong 4 stars. Absolutely loved it, would read again, highly recommend for a good time. So those are all my favorite books from May. Again, not to discredit any of the other amazing books I read that month, but let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about here, or if you would like to read them. Whatever you would like to share, head down to the comments below so we can discuss. But that's everything I have for this recap today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.